Welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. We're all about the places where design and development overlap. We talk with the industry experts about trends in design, development, and take a look at new ways to build digital experiences, typically over a beer or two. Today I'm here with Marco Suárez. Marco is a product designer, and he also runs his own design system consultancy. He helps other businesses and large enterprises kind of get a handle on how to implement and use design systems really effectively. He's also the co-owner of Methodical Coffee, which I'm sure we'll get into today. Welcome, Marco. Really glad you're able to make it. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
A lot of, in kind of figuring out what we were going to chat about today, a lot of it kind of came back to this idea of helping people create really great systems and how those systems apply very broadly across people's lives, across the decisions that businesses make. And I think a big part of this is I wanted to really get into your experience personally. I know you've worked with Etsy and MailChimp and InVision, I believe, right?
Yeah.
And so with those, one big company that is focused on design very heavily, and then two actual like real prevalent design systems. Talk to me a little about what that was like. Like, what was it like to be in an industry as it was kind of emerging and coming up? And what were some of the things that you were trying to figure out along the way?
It's interesting. When you look back, you see the common thread, but in the moment, you're just kind of trying to figure out what to do. But previous to all those, I worked for a startup called Zarly. And that was my first interaction with design systems, even though we didn't call it that. And me and two engineers developed what we called a style guide. Mm-hmm. It was basically a design system, typography, colors, components. And the problem we were solving there is, one, we wanted to create a catalog of all the things that we had in our UI. Mm-hmm. But then also design was having a hard time keeping up with engineering. So we wanted to give engineers a tool they could use to kind of get ahead.
Gotcha. So what form did this early design system style guide take? Because it sounds a lot like my experience where the very first ones of these that I was building, we didn't know what to call them.
Yeah.
What was this? Was this code? Was it a bunch of organized design files? Like, what was the approach you guys took?
It was code. So that application was Ruby on Rails, and this was, and I'm going to be hitting my lack of knowledge of engineering. It was a gem that we would distribute to the different parts of the app that the engineers could use. And we had the actual component, then we had, I think, less and CSS that they could toggle between to get all the code they needed to implement it, and some very light documentation and nomenclature, naming, that kind of stuff. And we called it the Hammer of Justice, and justice was spelled JUSTICSS.
That's an incredible name. Is there a picture of you in like Thor's armor on the front of that thing?
I did not name it, but all the images we used were of kind of Nordic gods, and then the fake copy were all Dragon Force lyrics.
Dude, I haven't heard that name in a while. I remember playing Dragon Force on like Guitar Hero back, a decade ago in my friend's living room. That's awesome.
Again, I had nothing to do with that. It was the two engineers were the ones that came up with all that. But the fun thing was we had a certain brand, and we rebranded the company. And we had to implement all these changes, and it made implementing those changes really easy. And it was that kind of magical moment you see where you make these changes, you save it, you ship out, cut a new gem or whatever. It implements, and you're like, wow, that was actually really easy.
Was that the intent from the beginning? Was to try to make it so that updates and changes were going to be easier?
I think so. I think that was part of the value that we foresaw. And this was, again, because this is my first experience, I didn't have a lot of opinions or thoughts on what this was or what we should be doing with it. It was more so of like, we kind of have this need, and working with engineers, like, okay, we'll build this thing. And it's kind of the brainchild of the engineers more so than me. And I was the designer that was helping out. And then after that, I was like, oh, like, this is the way everything should be done. And that's where interesting, like when I was at MailChimp, kind of asking those questions, do we have, a style guide, code repository of the components? And they didn't have anything when I started there. And then they started working on one. I got a little bit of time to contribute to it before I moved on from MailChimp. Obviously, they have a really great resource. And I also worked a bit on their content style guide as well.
So you had this experience where you sort of saw the light, if you will, around design systems. You saw how practical and how easy they could be in order to help maintain systems, to update things, change things. And then you go over to this like really gigantic company. I guess MailChimp maybe wasn't like as super gigantic then as they are now.
Right.
And you go and you're like, let's go do this same thing. And so the idea was trying to get buy-in, trying to get traction. Was it already in progress and you were trying to figure out how best to contribute?
Yeah.
Kind of what was the landscape when you got there?
It was, I saw the value of it at Zarly, but I really didn't. It wasn't until I was at Etsy where I saw like, this is a big deal. This is really helpful. When I was at MailChimp, it was like, man, this is really cool. We should do this. And I wasn't on the product team at the time. I was on the marketing team. So I wasn't involved. But because I had experience with it, then I was kind of brought in like more of a consultant relationship than it was actually contributing to it. And looking through the designs and kind of giving like, oh, like if we did typography this way, then you can achieve these things. And it was years after I left before they, I think, actually used it.
Gotcha.
It's interesting because the same issues where you would, I remember talking to one of the product designers about the web app and talking about how there's so much inconsistency with the topography and kind of like, well, yeah, like what happened with that style guide or is that being built out or are you using it? And it's like, well, the typical story of, we don't have time to work on it. We don't have the resources or, it's not a priority. But it's funny to see even looking back then, and this was when MailChimp was much smaller, that they were experiencing the same pain points that pretty much every company does. And arriving to the same conclusion that a design system is how we can help with this.
Right, and trying to find that time and that prioritization. We were just at an event apart last week in San Francisco, and Mina Markham gave this great talk about the mythical "when I have time." And her big emphasis for that was like, make sure you actually, if you're valuing a design system and truly valuing it, make sure it ends up on a roadmap.
Yeah,
because that's knowing that you need to take that time to actually make a system that ultimately is there to save you time and address those things like inconsistencies of typography and stuff like that you brought up, right? Like the amount of wasted resources that go into fixing typography. If you have to do that every 6 months, like why not just fix it once and build a system and make it so you don't ever have to fix it again? Yep. I guess it's kind of like what you and I mean when we talk about the trade-offs and the decisions you're making about as a business when you include something in the design system and when you don't. And so you were about to talk about Etsy. I'm curious about that experience, but it's specifically how it relates to making those decisions about what this design system was going to be and how it was going to get implemented. Yeah.
So Etsy was a really awesome experience. And when I started there, it was a bit of a shock, honestly, to be like, okay, here's a large company that's been around for a while, almost 10 years when I joined there. And they didn't have anything. Everything was bespoke. And their, CSS was just a hot mess. And I remember like kind of poking around and calling out some errors in, how things were built, like the actual CSS, like the wrong border radius we used on one thing and another. And kind of like, I was like, hey, like, are we going to fix these? And it's kind of like like in our extra time, we go through these paper cuts and fix them. And so I advocated for a design system for a while. And amongst the other designers, it was a lot of like, yes, we need to do this. We need to do this. And it wasn't until another team kind of went, not necessarily rogue, but they decided to do it. And so they were working on a new feature and they decided to build a design system that powered that feature with the intent that this would eventually be kind of released to the wider team and could be contribute to and grown. And that's exactly what they did.
So it started as an insurgency for them, where there was this particular group within product that was like, we're doing this, we're making this system to go address this problem.
Yep. And they released it. And when I saw it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. This is exactly what we need. When can I use this? And eventually they opened it up and it's like, okay, it's good enough. Like I said, they just built enough to power this one feature. And with some vision for the future, but it wasn't very comprehensive. And so they finally opened it up, and then we created a working group that the design team would meet every other Friday and just work on it. And so we would have quarterly, projects, and we would have a big party at the end of the quarter and do kind of like a demo day and all the things that we accomplished. And it was incredible because for one, it allowed us to work together when we normally wouldn't.
Right.
We were all on our own discrete teams, and this allowed us to get together, kind of hang out, have fun, and contribute to something that we benefit from. And then it also grew the design system and grew the buzz in the company to the point where the leadership finally decided that we need to invest in this. that this is powering enough things and there's enough potential in this that we actually need to form a team around this and continue to grow it.
Yeah, so you got to a critical mass, and that critical mass then got the attention and got budget and got funding for the project. And so it's funny because there's a lot of parallels between kind of the process of building these design systems and very iterative, agile approaches. And so when you had this working group that you guys met together, like just the mere fact that you had a regular set time where you spent a couple of hours a month, or a week working on this thing, I think that sort of speaks to the iterative nature of those sorts of design systems. So, like, what was the makeup of this team? Was this something that was like really cross-functional? Were there project managers? Were there coders? Were there designers? Was it just the design team? Like, who was really driving that? Was that you as a champion that was like, this is awesome, we need to do more of this? Or was this, the original creators of the system? How did that come to pass?
It started out as the original creators leading it. It's primarily a designer named Jessica Harley. She really spearheaded it. And it was primarily the design team for most of that working group's existence. But then there were other things we needed to do with A/B testing and stuff that we needed to bring in engineers. And we were able to rope in a couple engineers to contribute to it. But outside of that, not really anyone else. There wasn't any PMs. And it was hard to get people to allocate resources. This was all in your free time and your extra time, which no one has that. But it was like, over lunch, we're going to get together and we're going to work on this if anyone wants to join.
Beer and pizza o'clock.
Yeah.
What are some lessons that you take away from that? Like, what is the learning from that really practical side of getting this off the ground?
The biggest lesson I learned is, in order to drive adoption, you have to get people involved. You have to create that perception of ownership. If it's a walled garden where only a few people own it and can contribute to it, it's going to be really hard to drive adoption and to get people to value it. Now, if they have invested their own energy into it, then that creates that perception of ownership. Therefore, they're going to use it. Mm-hmm. They're invested in it. And so that was probably the biggest thing. And the lesson I took at InVision is I also kind of mirrored that type of work of distributing the work amongst the entire design team as opposed to me doing it all, and getting other designers involved on like discrete projects like iconography, typography, color, whatever it is. And that also worked great at InVision to get designers familiar with it. They invested in it, and therefore they became ambassadors for it, and they got their teams to use it. So it created that network spread that we really needed.
So you're creating champions while you're creating the design system.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then those people see the value, they understand the value because they're in it and they're helping create it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really insightful. I think that there's a lot of teams that we work with where there's a handful of folks that it's like their responsibility to do it all. And I've always actually wondered how that works when you start to think about scale, right? So you launch your product or you launch your particular digital property, website, whatever, on a design system. And then you go like, hey, I've built this really incredible thing. What's next? And I think that that's another thing that I'd like to hear from you on. When you have this first nascent design system that, yeah, it's valuable, but it's not comprehensive. Maybe documentation isn't quite where you want it to be. Maybe there's a few things that are missing. They're really important pieces. How do you go from that sort of nascent prototypical design system to start to scale this across an organization?
And that's what I've also seen as a trend talking with other companies. If you're just talking about it, it's really hard to get buy-in from leadership. It's really hard to get resources, budgets, and headcount. But if you're able to show them something, then it's a lot easier. And so I think this idea of going rogue and creating it and using it, and then it's also a form, I guess, of like twisting their arms, where like, okay, this is getting a lot of buzz, it's getting a lot of attention, people are using it, we need to invest in it. It's a heck of a lot easier, because from a leadership position, it's much easier to say like, keep going, than it is start or let's spin this thing up.
That's a really good point. When you put yourself in the shoes of that director or that VP that is sitting there like making a budget decision about a design system and trying to understand like, is this thing real? Is this working? Is there value that I can show for this budget or this time that my team has put into this? That's something that's a major decision point. Like, I'm going to go put, a couple $100,000 or whatever be that in direct cost, in agencies, in headcount, whatever that is. That's a substantial expenditure. And then also to think about, so I've made this initial investment. Now I have this thing that is its own product that I have to keep investing in and keep maintaining. Yeah. And so it's very important to show the value of that. Like, what are some of the ways that, you talk kind of generally about like leadership noticing this, like what are some of the ways that you made it show up?
That working group was a very tangible thing because it was a 2-hour meeting every other Friday on everyone's calendar. I have no idea what leadership's perception was of that, but they got really excited about it and really loved what we were doing when they saw us taking this initiative. And also finding a use case, a case study of it actually working. And there was another team that had to rebuild, part of Etsy, and they used the design system. And they were like the poster child for like, this project could have taken us 6 months, ended up only taking us 3. The build time, like the front end time, was nothing compared to past projects because it was so easy to build. And so I got like a nice case study that I was able to shop around. And when we talk about, risk and like time being risk, and the longer it takes to do something, the risk increases. Like this is a great example of how to minimize the risk, how to get things out, do better work, and be able to be more efficient.
So who produced that case study? Did you guys like have maybe not physical paper, but digital paper that was like, this is what we did and this is the value that it brought?
I kind of interviewed that designer and wrote something up, asked her some questions, got like some nice quotes and sound bites from like their PM and engineers and stuff like that, and was able to like, have that, copy paste it, share it around. I think we even use it in a slide deck for some presentation as well. And also the product launch went well. It didn't, everything is measured at Etsy. And so when you see a project that everyone is really like, fingers crossed, hope this doesn't tank metrics, and it does well, and you're like, sweet,
right? No,
we're going to use this.
No, and that's a great feather, right? To have that, not just a successful launch, but also a write-up of what that successful launch kind of meant and what brought you there.
Yep.
And that seems like an incredible tool to get other parts of an organization really excited about the design system work that you're doing.
Yeah.
Even if they're completely unaware of it existing in the first place, like being able to say like, hey, we built this thing and it went well, and not just it went well, but here's like actually some voice of the engineers, voice of the product owners, really kind of showcasing the value of this that they could then capture themselves.
It got to the point when leadership decided to build a design system, a team around this design system. They talked to me, and at this point I was a huge champion of the design system. I contributed to it, but I wasn't necessarily one of the designers leading it. But they asked if I would be interested in being a designer on that team. And at first I was like, I think there are other designers that are more capable, but okay, we'll do this. It was during that time when it really sunk in, and I really saw like, wow, this has a lot of potential. Because I feel like in every company, when you have teams formed around discrete parts of an application, they're not going very wide, but they're going very deep into a subject. And they kind of create these silos. And when you're on those teams, you interface just with the teams that impact you or you impact them.
Right. There's little bridges that get built, but maybe not a wide network of them.
Yeah. But when I was on this team and I was talking with all designers and working with them, I realized that I was developing a very wide understanding of what was going on in the company, and began to identify trends, and was seeing how the design system could help us with some of the problems we had, because it is standardization. And that's one thing that we really needed. And we needed to be able to document and explain and critique the different ways in which we work and the things that we value and how we just approach our design at Etsy. The thing that I liked about it is that it wasn't tribal knowledge. It was documentation. It was something that could be taught. It could be picked up by new designers and learned. It could be critiqued and refined and edited. And it existed outside of everyone's head. And that to me was really powerful, because it started to create this gravitational pull to keep all of design and the user experience of Etsy like together, as opposed to everything just kind of shooting out in all these different directions and kind of people doing what was right in their own eyes and creating this very fragmented experience.
As always, this podcast is brought to you by Basalt, a full-service digital agency. Basalt is committed to building a better web and specializes in creating design systems. Learn more at basalt.io. I really like what you said about something that's teachable, right? So when you think about how organizations share knowledge inside of their teams, and how when you start to look at this problem of standardization, right? Standardization inside of a 5-person or even a 25-person team is maybe possible to hold predominantly in the brains of the people that work inside of that team. But once you start to look at standardization at scale, you all of a sudden end up in a place where the people that are absorbing that knowledge might not ever actually meet the people that created it.
Yeah.
And I think that notion of a design system making a systematic approach to design teachable, I think that's a really powerful statement.
Yes.
I really like that.
Yeah. And it's also nice because when you look at the org structures of tech companies, design is organized similarly to engineering. There's directors and there's managers and there's ICs. They're not structured in like classical design with art directors and creative directors and production artists and stuff. And that structure is very hierarchical, where you're doing the bidding of the art director or the creative director. Whereas engineering structures are not like that. But design is different than engineering. And so you need something that is kind of a mix of the two. Yeah, as an IC, I did not want to just like be dictated to what I should be changing in my designs. I wanted, problems to solve. But I still needed this like program, this guide for how I apply design to these problems. And UI sense, like which components I'm using,
right,
how I'm using them, being consistent, and then even down to how I do user testing or the principles I'm applying in my UX design and IA, all of the like pre-pixel to artboard kind of stuff. The more you can set that expectation, then when you look at work and you're critiquing it, you're going to know, okay, this person has done this amount of research because that's what they're supposed to do. And if they didn't, like, well, that's a red flag. Like, what did you learn about when you talked to customers, or the research when you worked with our research team? What are you basing this on? And it sets the expectations for how to work with each other. And you need that when you're in a large org. Because you're right. Sometimes you don't have a lot of interaction with some of the people you're working with. You need to have as clear expectation as possible when you're working together.
Yeah, and so you played a lot of different parts in these sorts of organizations, right? You've had a lot of different roles in your career. You've had stuff that is very tech influenced. You've had stuff that's very design influenced. You have an expertise in coffee now. So when you look at these ideas of what goes into a system and what doesn't, you talked about that a second ago. When you're looking at creating a teachable, scalable system that works across all these different groups of stakeholders, some of which are siloed, some of them may never have met each other. What goes in and what comes out? Or I guess that's maybe not the right way to put it. Like, what do you try to wrap a system around, and what do you just say, like, this is the domain of this particular discipline or this particular product, and that doesn't need to exist elsewhere?
This is a great question. This might get heady, but there's a size in which it's too small to really be viable. And there's also a size that is too big to where it'll crumble under its own weight. I am fascinated with agriculture and farming and read any book I can on it. Farming, this is very true really of any industry, but in particularly farming, if you want to be a professional farmer, you can't just grow a little garden in your backyard because you're not gonna be able to produce enough product to make a living. On the opposite side of that, with monoculture, industrial farming, you're growing tens of thousands of acres of the same crop, which introduces a whole other host of problems. Having the amount of inputs and cost that goes into that with machinery and herbicides, seed, fertilizers, that kind of stuff. But there is this sweet spot in the middle where a farm is self-sufficient. It's a closed system because all parts of it are contributing. It's large enough to where you're able to produce enough product to make a living. And a lot of times that smaller farm, that farmer can actually make a better living than this, industrial farmer who's farming tens of thousands of acres with high tech. The same thing is true with design systems. There was another company that I was interviewing with. They were telling me some of their problems. They're a larger company, and they were basically trying to get their design system to power a lot of different things. And even at Etsy, in my time there, we were trying to okay, let's power everything with this one little design system. We can theme it. We can do all kinds of things with it, all kinds of dark magic to make it work for all these things. But the reality is you're creating a monoculture with that. And so there is, with the design system in a company, there is a size at which if it's too small, if it's powering too little, then you're not getting enough bang for your buck.
Right.
The amount of energy and money you're putting into it, you're not going to get a return.
It's subsistence instead of scale. And
then there is a size at which you're beyond its limits of what it can do. And that's where you run into problems and people being skeptical of design systems, they won't work. Well, you're trying to apply a system to probably too large of a thing. And how you break it up can be very tricky. At a place like Etsy that has internal tools and it has seller tools and has a marketplace, there are very clear lines in which you can say, we have a design system for this and for this and for this. And there, is maybe a transcendent layer that goes over all of that is embodies the brand expression and these core things that we want to be consistent across all of them.
Right. But those digital boundaries are sort of pre-drawn for you in a lot of cases.
Right. So it's kind of tough to be able to find those lines in other organizations. But the reality of like, if you try to push something beyond its scale to where you're working with the diseconomies of scale as opposed to the economies of scale, you're going to run into problems. And that's where you get a lot of like people pushing back on design systems because it can't meet every single use case.
Yeah, it's funny. I was reminded of a conversation we were having earlier this week with a client where their product team had been using the design system, and they're starting to get their marketing team engaged in it. And the thing that someone on their marketing team said was, the moment that you can get me a digital design tool that I can create a 600-inch by 80-inch banner to sit behind me at a booth and have it look right, that's when I'll believe that like the design system is a real thing here. And that really struck me as like, that's a use case in physical medium coming from a digital design system that was the leap that person had to feel like they had to make in order for this to be useful for them. And that's a big hurdle. Like that's the distance between, hey, I want to power my website with a bunch of components, and hey, I want to be able to print like a backdrop to a booth at a conference. Like that's pretty broad. Now, I'm sure that like from an engineering or designing standpoint, you can see a pathway there, right? Like there's a way there somehow, but that is more than any single tool, more than any single department, more than any single process that has to be engaged in that in order to make that possible. Yeah. And there becomes a point where you wonder, like, is that the right thing? Or is that a separate system that you need to think about for those other ways of building those things that don't necessarily fit within the core of the system? Yeah. And kind of how we've always thought about that, and I'd actually be curious of your opinion on this, is we think about those like low level bits that link things together, right? Like those design tokens, as Salesforce and others call them, is like, sure, you might have something that's a giant piece of print medium, you might have a native app, you might have a website, but ultimately things like colors and typography tend to link those things together pretty well. I mean, would those be the best practices of farming, right? Like the tools that you always use no matter what. And then there's just a matter of understanding scale beyond that. What's your opinion on that?
How to draw to farming is a really good question. I mean, like I call these parts the visual or design language. And it's how you use things like typography, color, shape, space, which has a purpose and a style. And the purpose of that kind of transcends everything. Like you're going to use color on print the same way you use it in an application or whatever. And that the style might change. So like at Etsy, the Etsy orange reads different in print than it does in digital. It's probably fine to have a different RGB value or a CMYK value as the, hex value.
HSL, man.
Yeah. Yeah. But how you use it doesn't necessarily change. As far as like the farming analogy, you're right in the sense that a plant requires certain things. It requires sun and dirt and moisture, nitrogen, and that applies on your backyard as the fields of Nebraska or whatever. And there's those best practices that are applied. There's in different scales, and the output is different. Mm-hmm. It requires a lot of discipline and patience. Let's talk about shape. What are the different shapes that we use? How do we use them? How does that impact the visual language and differentiate one component from another? And like, how can we use shape to do that? People want to jump to the design tokens and the components and stuff. But if you aren't consistent on that language layer, it's going to cause problems with your components. And even not only the way you build your components, but when you apply them together, it's not going to look quite right. But if you have that layer that like filters down to everything consistently, then you can make things work. It doesn't have to be the same design system. It can be, three different design systems that are powering different things. But if they all share that higher level visual language, the style might be different. It might be a different hex code or a different typeface or whatever. But how you use those things shouldn't change. Right. And it's interesting to talk to other companies and other designers, even the companies that I consult with, and kind of push them on those things. Everyone has the same problems. It's kind of comical how we're all these separate businesses, but we're all trying to fix the same things. You realize when you push, especially designers, on those questions, what is that color used for? Why are you using it that same color for this thing as that thing? Like, what is the purpose of it? Is you start to unravel a lot of these, like, I didn't think about that. Mm-hmm. And then you get to a place where you're able to standardize and get on the same page and then document it, and everyone's able to, keep moving.
Or maybe you end up in a place where you gain a greater understanding of why they chose that color, right? I mean, that's the positive side, right? Is that occasionally you get to a point where these are like very well thought out decisions, and people can talk about why they're using this particular kind of soil or why their crop has this much sun every day.
Yeah.
So I really love that analogy. One thing that I definitely didn't want to miss out on in this conversation is tell me a little bit more about the coffee business, man.
Yeah.
Why coffee, and what do you take from tech into that business?
Yeah. So I got into it because I had an entrepreneurial itch. I want to do something that was in real life versus digital. My entire career was digital, and you push something to production, it gets overwritten and changed and edited. So much of my labor over years and years and years as a designer had been deleted, basically. And
right, like those text files that you can pass down to your children, right?
Exactly. And I also thought that a coffee shop would be easy. My initial idea was I want to brand it, I want to design it. And I had a lot of opinions on how to use branding and design in a physical space. And then I wanted to kind of fade away into the shadows and then continue in my design career. But after we opened up our first location, you fall in love with it, but also you get sucked into it. Mm-hmm. There's just like countless problems to fix. It was that, and I knew that at some point there would be a crossroads where I'd have to decide whether to continue my design career or whether to pursue, running my business. The other thing too with coffee is it's a volume game, because you're selling, $3 or $4 cups of coffee. To really make any money, you got to sell a lot of it, which requires a lot of strategy and marketing and labor to figure that out. Me and my partners were always kind of strategizing and trying to think of like what to do next. And our first shop did really well initially. In my town in Greenville, South Carolina, there was a void. There was an opportunity to create a modern coffee shop, one that takes coffee seriously, that the space is more contemporary, and we're labeled the hipster coffee shop around here. And
yeah, we have like a dozen of those on my street in Portland. So I think you probably picked the right market.
This is that scale question. One location of a coffee shop where you're buying other people's coffee, especially, and reselling it, is too small to really make it worth it. And so we knew we needed to scale. And so the next thing was roasting that we wanted to get into. So a couple of years after we opened our first location, we started roasting. And then last year, in 2018, we opened our second location. And this year, as of just about 3 weeks ago, we opened our third location.
Oh, congratulations. That's awesome.
Yeah, thanks. So our holiday party is the weekend after New Year's, and we're going to have, with everyone's significant other, over 60 people, which 2 years ago, with everyone's significant others, it was like 18 or 20.
That's awesome.
And so we've grown significantly, which introduced a whole host of problems. And so beginning in the spring, I started thinking about that. As we're scaling, it's introducing a lot of need for standardization. When we were just one location with 7 employees or 6 employees, that tribal knowledge was really easy to pass. And it's really easy for new people to come in and to learn our culture, because there was one place to do it, and we were all in that one location. We were all there. We knew everything that was happening. And now we have 3 locations, and we have a chef. We have a whole food program now. And so there's a lot, and over 30 employees. So there's a lot more that we need to standardize. When do you decide to standardize? We started feeling the pain of not having that. We were screwing up on our training for new employees, to where new employees were not getting the training and the work as we would when we were a smaller team. And so we needed to standardize our training. The other thing too is what you standardize and what you don't is super important, as we were talking about earlier, because every manager is running to the restaurant equipment shop to pick up stuff.
Right.
They're all ordering the same things. They're all ordering milk. They're all ordering chai, all ordering cups and stuff. And that was a lot of this redundant work. And like you were saying, fix it once and then benefit from it, as opposed to constantly be doing the same thing over and over and over again.
Right.
I kind of felt like we were redrawing a button over and over and over and over again. And so we consolidated all that into an operational position that my business partners took that role. And so we consolidated all that buying into one person. And the thing is, Greenville's a small town. All 3 of our locations are relatively close. And I was worried that we would be cannibalizing ourselves. And so I was like, these 3 shops need to have their own distinct personality, their own kind of take on the brand. They're siblings, but they're not twins,
right,
or triplets.
So you have this idea of like, how does each of these things remain distinct yet still share in this common pool of resources and culture and those things that don't need to be repeated 3 times.
Yeah, if you get a cappuccino at one location, it needs to be prepared with the same intentionality and thought and care as any other shop. So you want that to be consistent across all locations, but the offerings might change depending on where they're located. And we wanted to keep that agility and uniqueness and ability to like do different things while also benefiting from the economies of scale of like buying power and training and that kind of stuff.
No, it's a very interesting sort of analogous idea, right? And it makes sense because we talk so much about how humans and process are a really important part of this, and seeing that it comes from a very human place for you is really interesting.
Yeah.
Hey, Marco, thanks so much for taking the time to meet with us today. It's really great to get a take on people and coffee and design systems and all the interesting work you've done in your career. I just have a couple of questions left. First, we just ordered a bunch of your coffee online, and I want to make sure that we got the right thing. What are you drinking these days?
My go-to is our washed Ethiopian Guji.
Oh, yes. That was my number one pick.
Oh, really?
I feel so good about that. Yeah.
So Ethiopia is like the center of the coffee world. That's kind of where coffee was discovered hundreds of years ago. And Guji is one of the main regions there, and wash is the process. So there's different ways to process coffee. Natural and wash are the 2 primary ones. The natural one leaves the cherry on the bean to dry, and that imparts a lot of that flavor, fruity flavor. And when they wash it, it's removed. So you don't get as much of that. So there's a hint of that kind of berryness, but having it on the natural it's still really good, and it's the same coffee. You're kind of going for a different flavor profile there. But with the wash, you're able to still have a rich cup of coffee with a good like body, but it still has a little bit of that bright note to it.
Awesome.
And so just for like a daily drinker, it's always my go-to.
Well, I'm really looking forward to trying it. My personal thing with coffee has always been varietal.
Yeah.
And that varietal to me is kind of what makes a lot of difference. I believe this one was a bourbon. Mm-hmm. So I'm excited.
You probably know more better than I do because I can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, I was just looking last night. So again, Methodical Coffee, you can order online. I highly recommend it.
Yeah, thanks.
Though I have yet to taste it. I'm very excited to try it.
Hope it's good.
Try it in a couple of days.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, hey, again, really appreciate you coming on the program. Great to talk with you. Look forward to running into you and hopefully sitting down and having a nice, delicious cup of coffee soon.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. This has been a blast.
That's all for today. We'd love to hear from you with questions, ideas for new episodes, beer recommendations, or comments. You can find us on Twitter @TheDSPod. Cheers, and thanks for listening to the Design Systems Podcast.